March 6, 1944, shortly after noon. General Adolf Galland stood in the operations room at Luftwaffe headquarters in Berlin, eyes fixed on radar screens flickering with incoming contacts. 730 Allied bombers were approaching the German capital from England, 580 miles away. He allowed himself a thin smile. The Americans were making a fatal mistake. Their heavy bombers, B-17 Flying Fortresses and B-24 Liberators, were slow, vulnerable targets at 25,000 feet, and they were flying beyond the range of any Allied fighter escort. His interceptors would slaughter them. But then at 12:37 p.m., something appeared on the radar screens that made absolutely no sense. Small, fast-moving contacts were flying alongside the bomber formations. Single-engine fighters. Impossible. No single-engine fighter in the world possessed the range to fly from England to Berlin and back. The distance was too great. The fuel requirements were insurmountable. Yet there they were, silver dots in the sky, weaving protective patterns around the bomber streams. P-51 Mustangs, over Berlin. Galland had been General der Jagdflieger, General of Fighters, since November 1941. He was 32 years old, a veteran of the Spanish Civil War and the Battle of Britain with 104 confirmed kills. He understood air combat better than any officer in the Luftwaffe, and he knew what he was seeing on those radar screens meant the war in the air was lost. But how had the Americans done it? How had they solved the unsolvable problem of range? The secret weapon, the P-51 Mustang's secret was its engine. In 1942, engineers replaced the original American Allison power plant with a Rolls-Royce Merlin, the same engine that drove the legendary Spitfire. The Merlin featured a two-stage supercharger that maintained 1,490 horsepower even at 25,000 feet, where other engines gasped for oxygen and lost power. Britain couldn't manufacture enough Merlins for both nations' needs, so the Americans industrialized the solution. Packard Motor Car Company in Detroit began producing Merlins under license. By March 1944, Packard was churning out 4,000 engines per month. Germany was producing 1,200 fighters per month, all types combined. The industrial mathematics were already hopeless. The mission on the morning of March 6, 1944, at 10:15 a.m., 658 B-17 Flying Fortresses and 72 B-24 Liberators lifted off from airfields scattered across eastern England. Escorting them were 801 fighters. At 11:42 a.m., the bomber stream crossed the Dutch coast at 25,000 feet. Galland's radar operators tracked them penetrating deep into German airspace. Standard procedure. The Luftwaffe would wait until they were far inside Germany, beyond escort range, then strike with overwhelming force. But at 12:37 p.m., something impossible appeared on the radar screens. The small, fast contacts were still there, still escorting the bombers, 60 miles west of Berlin. Galland called Derberitz Airfield directly. "What are those contacts?" "Single-engine fighters, Herr General, American P-51s. "Impossible, they don't have the range." "They're here, Herr General." At 12:50 p.m., Galland ordered the interception. Every available fighter in the Berlin defense zone scrambled, 160 Bf-109 G6s and FW-198s from Jagdgeschwader 3, JG-11, and JG-300. The plan was straightforward. Ignore the escorts, hit the bombers hard, break through the formations, and destroy as many B-17s as possible before the Americans could react. It had worked before. In October 1943, during the Second Schweinfurt raid, the Luftwaffe had shot down 60 B-17s in a single mission, a devastating 20% loss rate. The Americans had suspended deep penetration raids for 4 months, but that was October, this was March, and everything had changed. First contact at 1:05 p.m., the first Luftwaffe fighters reached the bomber stream 40 miles west of Berlin. Major Gunther Specht, commanding IIJG-11, led 32 Bf-109s in a head-on attack against the lead B-17 formation. Standard tactics: approach from 12 o'clock high, fire a 3-second burst from 1,000 yards, break down and away before the bomber gunners could track you. But before Specht could close to firing range, 8 P-51s from the 357th Fighter Group dove on his formation from 28,000 feet. The Mustangs had a 3,000-foot altitude advantage and a 40-mile-per-hour speed advantage. The Bf-109s never had a chance. In the next 90 seconds, the P-51s shot down 4 Bf-109s and damaged 3 more. Specht's attack completely disintegrated. The bombers flew on, untouched. At 1:18 p.m., Galland received the first loss reports: 4 fighters down, 7 pilots missing, 0 bombers destroyed. The problem was the engine. At 25,000 feet, the Packard Merlin in the P-51 produced 1,490 horsepower. The BMW 801 radial engine in the FW-190 produced 1,700 horsepower at sea level. But at altitude, power dropped to barely 1,200 horsepower. The FW-190 was 30 miles per hour slower than the Mustang above 20,000 feet. The BF-109 G6 was even worse. Its Daimler-Benz DB605 engine produced 1,475 horsepower at sea level, but only 1,100 horsepower at 25,000 feet. Top speed at altitude, 386 miles per hour. The P-51 could outrun it, outclimb it, and outturn it, and there were so many of them. Galland's intelligence reports had estimated 150 P-51s in the 8th Air Force. The actual number was 238, and they were all over Berlin. Galland takes to the sky at 1:40 p.m. Galland made a decision. He would see this for himself. He ordered his personal FW-190A8 prepared at Derberitz Airfield and drove the 15 miles from headquarters at high speed. He was airborne by 2:05 p.m., climbing through 15,000 feet over the western suburbs of Berlin. The sky was full of contrails, white lines scratching across the blue, marking the paths of bombers and fighters at 25,000 feet. He could hear the radio chatter, frantic German voices calling out enemy positions, warning of attacks, reporting losses. At 2:18 p.m., he spotted them. A formation of 36 B-17s flying in tight defensive boxes, their contrails streaming behind like chalk lines drawn across the sky. And above them, weaving back and forth in loose pairs, were the P-51s, silver aircraft with checkered noses and invasion stripes. They looked fast even from a distance. Galland pushed the throttle forward and climbed toward the bombers. His FW-190A8 was one of the best fighters Germany possessed. 1,700 horsepower, 4 20mm cannons, 2 13 machine guns. At low altitude, it could outfight anything the Allies fielded. But here, at 23,000 feet, the engine was struggling. The BMW 801 radial wasn't designed for high-altitude combat. Power output had dropped to barely 1,200 horsepower. His rate of climb was sluggish, 800 feet per minute instead of the 2,800 feet per minute he could achieve at sea level. At 2:22 p.m., 2 P-51s spotted him. They rolled inverted and dove, not directly at him, but in a wide, curving approach that would bring them onto his tail with a significant speed advantage. Galland recognized the tactic immediately. They were using their altitude and speed to dictate the terms of engagement. He had no choice. He pushed the stick forward and dove away, accelerating toward the ground. The P-51s followed, but they didn't press the attack. They had bombers to protect. They climbed back to their patrol altitude and resumed their weaving pattern. Galland leveled off at 18,000 feet and circled west of Berlin, watching. For the next 15 minutes, he observed the battle unfold. He saw BF-109s and FW-190s attempting to break through the fighter screen. He saw them shot down, one after another, by P-51s that were faster, higher, and far more numerous. He saw the bombers fly on untouched, toward their targets in the heart of Berlin. At 2:38 p.m., he heard the first bombs fall, distant thunder rolling across the city, the Erkner ball-bearing plant, the Daimler-Benz factory at Genshagen. The Americans were hitting precision targets in broad daylight, 580 miles from their bases in England. And there was nothing the Luftwaffe could do to stop them. The aftermath, Galland turned his FW-190 back toward Derberitz and landed at 2:55 p.m. He climbed out of the cockpit and stood on the tarmac, watching the contrails fade in the western sky. Around him, ground crews were refueling and rearming the few fighters that had survived the battle. Pilots were climbing out of their aircraft, shaken, exhausted, some wounded. One of them, a young lieutenant from JG-11, walked past Galland and said without being asked, "They're everywhere, Herr General. We can't get through. We can't even get close." Galland said nothing. He knew the pilot was right. By 3:30 p.m., the bombers were gone. They had turned west, back toward England, still escorted by P-51s. The Luftwaffe had launched 160 fighters. 66 had been shot down. 29 pilots were dead. 18 were wounded. 19 were missing. The Americans had lost 11 bombers and 5 fighters. Galland returned to headquarters and reviewed the loss reports. The numbers were catastrophic. In a single mission, the Luftwaffe had lost 41% of the fighters it had committed to the defense of Berlin. Replacement aircraft would take weeks to arrive. Replacement pilots, experienced pilots who could survive combat against the Americans, would take months to train, and the Americans would be back tomorrow. And the day after that, And the day after that. The mathematics of defeat what Galland understood, standing in that operations room on the afternoon of March 6, 1944, was that the air war over Germany was no longer a question of tactics or skill or courage. It was a question of mathematics, and the mathematics were hopeless. The United States was producing 2,000 P-51 Mustangs per month. Germany was producing 1,200 fighters per month, all types combined. The Americans were training 10,000 pilots per month. Germany was training 2,500. The Americans had 100-octane fuel in unlimited quantities. Germany was rationing 87-octane synthetic fuel made from coal. And now the Americans had solved the range problem. Their fighters could escort bombers anywhere in Germany. There were no safe targets anymore. No factories beyond reach. No cities that couldn't be bombed in daylight with precision. At 4:45 p.m., Galland received a telephone call from Reichsmarschall Hermann Goring. Goring was furious. He demanded to know why the Luftwaffe had failed to stop the raid. He accused Galland's pilots of cowardice. He insisted the P-51s over Berlin were a lie, a propaganda trick by the Americans. Galland interrupted him. Herr Reichsmarschall, I saw them myself. I was in the air over Berlin. The P-51s are real. They have the range, they have the performance, and there are hundreds of them. Goring refused to believe it. Impossible. Single-engine fighters cannot fly from England to Berlin. The distance is too great. They're using drop tanks, Herr Reichsmarschall, external fuel tanks. They drop them when they engage our fighters. It gives them the range. There was a long silence on the line. Then Goring said, if what you're saying is true, then we have lost the air war. Galland replied, yes, Herr Reichsmarschall, we have. Industrial reality, the P-51 Mustang was not a miracle weapon. It was the product of industrial capacity and engineering pragmatism, two things Germany could no longer match. The Packard Merlin engine was built in a factory in Detroit that covered 3.5 million square feet and employed 28,000 workers. The factory operated 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. It produced 4,000 engines per month, with tolerances measured in thousandths of an inch. Each engine was identical to the last. Each one produced exactly 1,490 horsepower at 25,000 feet. Germany's aero engine production, by contrast, was scattered across dozens of small factories, many underground, many bombed repeatedly by the Allies. The Daimler-Benz DB605 engine, the powerplant for the Bf-109, was built by hand with tolerances that varied from engine to engine. Quality control was inconsistent. Power output varied wildly. Some engines produced 1,475 horsepower. Others produced 1,300. Pilots never knew what they were getting. And Germany was running out of everything. Chromium for steel alloys, nickel for engine components, molybdenum for armor plate, rubber for tires, high-octane fuel for aircraft. By March 1944, the Luftwaffe was rationing fuel so severely that new pilots received less than 100 hours of flight training before being sent into combat. American pilots received 400 hours. The result was predictable. German pilots were shot down on their first or second mission. The few veterans who survived, men like Galland, were outnumbered and exhausted. The Americans, by contrast, had an endless supply of well-trained pilots flying superior aircraft with unlimited fuel and ammunition. The final calculation on March 8, 2 days after the Berlin raid, Galland met with Albert Speer, Minister of Armaments. Speer showed him the production figures for February 1944. Germany had produced 1,016 single-engine fighters. The Americans had produced 2,314 fighters, just P-51s and P-47s, not counting P-38s or naval aircraft. Speer said, we cannot win a war of attrition against American industry. We don't have the resources, we don't have the factories, we don't have the time. Galland said, then what do we do? Speer had no answer. Between March 6 and May 8, 1945, the day Germany surrendered, the 8th Air Force flew 238 more missions over Germany. P-51 Mustangs escorted bombers to every major city: Hamburg, Munich, Frankfurt, Nuremberg, Stuttgart, Cologne. They destroyed aircraft factories, oil refineries, rail yards, and bridges. They shot down 4,950 German aircraft in air-to-air combat. The Luftwaffe never recovered from March 6, 1944. Pilot losses were unsustainable. Fuel shortages grounded entire fighter wings. By D-Day, June 6, 1944, the Luftwaffe could muster only 319 fighters to oppose the Allied invasion of Normandy. The Allies had 5,000 aircraft over the beaches. The final battles Galland continued to fight. In November 1944, After repeated clashes with Goring over Luftwaffe strategy, he was relieved of his command as General of Fighters. In January 1945, he formed Jagdverband 44, an elite unit flying the new Messerschmitt Me-262 jet fighter. The Me-262 was faster than any Allied aircraft, 540 miles per hour, but it came too late and in far too few numbers. Germany produced 1,400 Me-262s. Only 200 saw combat. On April 26, 1945, Galland flew his last mission. He shot down a B-26 Marauder over Munich, his 104th and final kill. His knee was shattered by a .50 caliber bullet from a P-47 Thunderbolt. He crash-landed his Me-262 and was pulled from the wreckage by German soldiers. 12 days later, Germany surrendered. The interview after the war, Galland was interviewed by American intelligence officers. They asked him when he knew Germany had lost the war. He answered without hesitation, "The day I saw P-51 Mustangs over Berlin." It wasn't the bombers that defeated Germany. It was the fighters escorting them. The bombers destroyed factories and cities, but the fighters destroyed the Luftwaffe. They shot down experienced pilots who could never be replaced. They forced Germany to scatter its aircraft production into underground factories where quality control collapsed. They made it impossible for the Luftwaffe to concentrate its forces anywhere. And they did it with a combination of industrial capacity and engineering pragmatism that Germany could never match. The legacy the P-51 Mustang was not the best fighter of World War II in every category. The FW-190 had heavier armament. The Spitfire had a tighter turning radius. The Me-262 was faster, but the Mustang had something more important than any single performance characteristic. It had range, it had numbers, and it had an industrial base that could produce 15,000 of them in 3 years, while Germany struggled to build 30,000 fighters of all types in 6 years. On March 6, 1944, when Adolf Galland stood on the tarmac at Derberitz Airfield and watched the contrails fade over Berlin, he understood that the war was no longer about tactics or courage or even technology. It was about mathematics, and the mathematics were hopeless. The United States had outproduced, outtrained, and out-engineered Germany. The P-51 Mustang over Berlin was simply the proof. The turning point, the March 6, 1944 raid on Berlin, marked a fundamental turning point in the air war over Europe. For the first time, American fighters had escorted bombers to the German capital and back, a round trip of 1,100 miles. The Luftwaffe lost 66 fighters that day. The Americans lost 11 bombers and 5 fighters. It was the beginning of the end for German air power. By May 1944, the Luftwaffe had lost air superiority over Germany itself. By June 1944, it had lost air superiority over France. By September 1944, it had effectively ceased to exist as a strategic force. The P-51 Mustang flew more combat sorties than any other Allied fighter in Europe, 213,873 missions. It destroyed 4,950 enemy aircraft in the air and 4,131 on the ground. It escorted bombers on every major raid from March 1944 until the end of the war. Adolf Galland survived the war. He lived until 1996, dying at the age of 83. In his memoirs, he wrote, "The day I saw Mustangs over Berlin, I knew the jig was up."